Today we are making pumpkin spice granola. Now I am borrowing a recipe from Erin Lives Whole. I am modifying the recipe, so I'll be sure to link the original recipe down below in the description, but I will put in how I made mine here today. So to start, we need to preheat our oven to 325 degrees, and then you're going to want to get out a large mixing bowl. First thing we need is oatmeal. I'm using old-fashioned oats. We need 3 cups. Then we're going to add in some chopped pecans. We need 1.5 cups. The next ingredient our recipe calls for is shredded coconut. I personally don't care for the taste of coconut, so the recipe calls for 1 cup of shredded coconut. In its place, I'm just adding an extra cup of oatmeal. Another modification I'm making is this recipe calls for 1/4 cup of dry quinoa. I don't have quinoa, but I had chia seeds, so I meant to add just 1/4 cup of chia seeds. I accidentally added 1/2 cup of chia seeds, and spoiler alert, it all turned out just fine. Granola is just one of those recipes that it doesn't have to be quite perfect. Next up, we need pumpkin pie spice. I don't have pumpkin pie spice, but I have spices that make up pumpkin pie spice. So I used cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and allspice. So I'm still going to use 2 tablespoons of seasoning. This recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of pumpkin pie spice. In its place, I used 3 teaspoons of cinnamon. There's 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon. Then I added 1 teaspoon of allspice, 1 teaspoon of cloves, and 1 teaspoon of ginger. Now, this recipe was very heavy on the allspice. You could completely omit the allspice and in its place just use an extra teaspoon of cinnamon. Then we're going to add 1/2 teaspoon of salt. I use coarse kosher salt. Next, the original recipe calls for 1/2 cup of coconut oil. In its place, I'm using light olive oil. You can use whatever oil you like, as long as it's a light oil that has a more neutral flavor. Next, we need our sweetener. Today, we're using 1/2 cup of maple syrup, which adds a great fall flavor to this already pumpkin spiced granola. Now, this recipe is not super sweet, so take that into consideration. If you want a sweet granola that you may be eating by itself, you may want to consider adding an extra 1/4 cup of maple syrup. And then lastly, we are adding 1/2 cup of dried cranberries. Now, I messed up. We weren't supposed to add the cranberries until after the granola cooked, but again, it turned out just fine with them baking in the granola. Then this recipe doesn't call for it, but I'm adding 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Then go ahead and give that a good stir. Just make sure everything is mixed in evenly. All of your oats, pecans, cranberries are going to get a little bit of shine on them from the maple syrup and the oil. So once everything is nicely mixed together and nice and shiny, you're good to go. It smelled amazing. So once everything is well mixed together, you want to get out a large baking sheet, and we're going to line this with parchment paper. Now, there is a German chef that I follow on Instagram, and when he uses parchment to line his baking vessel, he always crumples up his parchment. And I've been trying it the last few times I've used it, and it just helps the parchment stay where you put it. Otherwise, it just kind of wants to roll back up and like slide off the top of your baking dish until you put something in there to hold it down. So maybe give that a try next time around. Go ahead and dump all of your granola onto your baking sheet now, and you have a couple options. If you like really crumbly granola, like each individual oat is by itself, you're gonna wanna spread your granola out as much as you can. But if you are someone who likes big granola clusters, you're going to want to pack your granola down. You're gonna wanna pack it in tight. So not just pushing it down, you wanna gather it together. So start by pulling it all to one end. And my layer was probably maybe a 1/2 inch thick. You could do a little thicker. It might just take a little bit longer to bake, but pull it all tight, nice to one side if you want those big clusters. So once you have your granola all spread out or packed down, whichever route you choose to take, we're gonna pop this into our preheated oven for 40 to 45 minutes or until the granola is lightly golden brown. Now, as you can see, it's already golden brown because our ingredients are pretty much brown, but you'll know the difference. It'll be more brown. For those of you who want really separated granola, you can halfway through the bake go in and give your granola a stir and then spread it back out and then let it finish its baking. But here is mine after 40 minutes. I did 40, and we need to let this sit for 20 minutes. Don't touch it. But once those 20 minutes are up, you can go ahead and, if you're like me and you packed your granola together, break up the granola. Now, make larger clusters than you want your end result to be, because as we go along our pan and break up the granola, little clusters are going to form, and then again when you transfer your granola to its container that it's going to live in until you eat it, it's going to break down into smaller clusters. So here's a peek at one of the clusters. Got a nice chunk of pecan in there. And if you eat this granola right away when it's still a little bit warm, it's not going to feel crunchy. But don't fret, as it cools completely, it will firm up and you will get that crunchy granola texture that you expect. And then here's a little cluster with some cranberry in it. And if I were to make this recipe again, I would either, instead of 1.5 cups of pecans and a 1/2 cup of craisins, I would use 1 cup of each, because like I mentioned earlier, this granola recipe is not very sweet at all. The bites of granola with the craisin are really good and bring that level of sweetness that I want. So I would either do 1 cup of pecans, 1 cup of craisins, or I do like the amount of pecans that are in this recipe. So 1.5 cups of pecans and 1 whole cup of craisins. The craisins are really few and far between in this recipe, so maybe I would do both the increase in maple syrup and the increase in craisins. Now, this recipe is versatile. You could also add raisins if you enjoy raisins in your granola, and that would fit the fall pumpkin spice motif that we've got going on here. So once your granola has cooled, go ahead and put it into some containers that you can store airtight. My granola was not completely cool when I put it into my jars, so I just left my jars on my counter without the lids on until my jar was no longer warm at any point around it. And then the author of this recipe says that this granola can be stored in an airtight container for up to 2 weeks if it makes it that long for you. But I think granola would also be a great little gift for someone, just to say, hey, I'm thinking of you and I know you love fall. So I will leave all of the ingredients, how I made this recipe, down below in the description along with the instructions. And again, I will link the original recipe if you do want to use the coconut and the coconut oil, etc. If you guys liked this video, please go ahead and give it a big thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe for more content. And if you're interested in another granola recipe, go ahead and click here on this video on screen, and I will see you guys there.